Brad Pitt's story is often told through images of success, red carpets, award stages, iconic film roles, and a career that helped define modern Hollywood. But behind the public version of that life lies a more complicated human journey, one shaped not only by achievement, but also by emotional distance, personal reinvention, and the cost of living for decades under constant visibility. This is not a story of downfall or redemption in simple terms. It is a story of tension between two realities that rarely coexist peacefully: the world's perception and private experience. For years, Pitt existed at the center of cultural attention, where admiration and expectation often blurred into pressure. His rise was fast, his fame global, and his influence undeniable. Yet the emotional weight of that position, relationships strained, personal identity questioned, and family life tested, became part of the quieter narrative that followed him. What makes his journey resonate is not perfection, but contradiction. A man celebrated for charm and success, yet often described in interviews and reflections as searching for grounding and meaning beyond achievement. This rewritten account explores that duality not as gossip or myth, but as a broader reflection on fame, identity, and the human need for connection. It is a portrait of someone who reached extraordinary heights, only to discover that elevation does not guarantee peace. And as the years pass, the question becomes less about what he achieved and more about what it cost, and whether balance is ever truly possible once a life has been lived in such intense public light. Early foundations: discipline, silence, and inner formation. Brad Pitt was born in 1963 in the American Midwest, raised in a household shaped by structure, faith, and expectation. His upbringing in Missouri was not marked by visible hardship, but by emotional restraint, a family environment where discipline was clear and expression often measured. This kind of childhood does not create visible fractures, but subtle ones: habits of self-containment, awareness of tone, and the early understanding that certain emotions are better hidden than expressed. As a child, Pitt was active, social, and outwardly confident, yet internally observant. He learned early how to navigate different environments, appearing relaxed at school while maintaining emotional control at home. That duality became a quiet foundation for how he would later move through the world, adapting, performing, adjusting. There was also a sense of ambition without clarity. He was drawn to storytelling and cinema long before he understood it as a career path. Movies became a private escape, spaces where emotion, conflict, and identity were allowed to exist more freely than in everyday life. That contrast between internal sensitivity and external expectation gradually shaped his worldview. Nothing in his early years suggested global fame. Instead, they built the psychological framework of someone who would later understand observation, performance, and reinvention at a deep level. The discipline of his upbringing provided structure, but also a quiet tension, the feeling of holding more inside than was ever expressed outwardly. That tension would follow him long after he left home. Leaving home, the decision that changed everything. The decision to leave university and move toward acting was not framed as ambition at the time, but as uncertainty. Pitt was close to completing his studies in journalism and advertising when he chose instead to drive toward Los Angeles, a city that represented possibility but offered no guarantees. It was a move defined less by confidence and more by instinct, a belief that staying would mean settling into a life that did not fully fit. Arriving in Los Angeles with limited money and no established connections, he entered a period that stripped away any romantic idea of success. Work was inconsistent, survival was practical, and progress was slow. He took whatever jobs were available, not as stepping stones, but as necessities. The contrast between expectation and reality was sharp. There was no immediate recognition, only endurance. Acting classes became a central anchor during this time. They were not just training spaces, but environments where vulnerability was encouraged rather than hidden. For someone accustomed to emotional restraint, this shift was significant. It allowed access to expression that had previously been controlled or suppressed. Those early years did not resemble a rise. They resembled persistence without certainty, but they formed something essential, a tolerance for uncertainty and rejection. More importantly, they marked the beginning of a shift from external definition to internal exploration. The identity he had inherited was beginning to dissolve, replaced by one that had not yet fully formed. Breakthrough and disorientation, sudden visibility. Success arrived in fragments before it arrived in full recognition. Early television appearances provided exposure but not stability. He was present on screen but not yet defined by it. That changed with a brief but impactful film appearance that captured widespread attention. Almost overnight, his image became recognizable, circulating widely and reshaping how audiences perceived him. However, visibility did not bring clarity. Instead, it introduced a new kind of tension. Being noticed did not automatically translate into being understood. He was suddenly categorized by appearance, presence, and charisma, qualities that, while real, did not fully represent the complexity he felt internally. This period created an unusual contradiction: professional momentum paired with personal uncertainty. The industry began to project identity onto him faster than he could define it for himself. That gap between public image and private experience widened with each new role and increasing attention. Rather than resolving insecurity, success amplified it. The challenge was no longer about being seen, it was about being seen accurately. The pressure of expectation became part of daily life, shaping choices and perceptions. What had once been anonymity was replaced by visibility that felt incomplete. This stage of his life marked a psychological turning point, recognition without grounding. It is often assumed that success resolves instability, but in his case, it introduced a different form of imbalance, one that would continue evolving as fame intensified. Fame and identity, the weight of being perceived. As his career expanded, Brad Pitt became one of the most recognizable figures in global entertainment. His roles in major films solidified both critical respect and cultural visibility. He was no longer simply an actor, he had become a symbol within popular imagination, associated with charisma, intensity, and cinematic presence. Yet symbolic identity can be limiting. The more defined the public image becomes, the harder it is to escape it. Over time, expectations narrowed around perception rather than individuality. This created a subtle but persistent tension between who he was and what he represented. Success brought opportunity, but also restriction. Certain roles reinforced existing perceptions, while others attempted to challenge them. Still, the challenge of separation between image and identity remained. In interviews and reflections, he occasionally hinted at dissatisfaction with being understood only through surface interpretation. This phase also intensified the pace of life. Projects, media attention, and public scrutiny left little space for pause or reflection. Fame operates without quiet intervals, and over time, that constant motion can become disorienting. Despite achievement, there remained an undercurrent of searching, not for validation, but for authenticity. The question shifted from "what can I achieve?" to "what remains when achievement is removed?" That question would become increasingly relevant in the years ahead: relationships and emotional complexity. Alongside professional success, personal relationships became a central and often complicated part of his life. High-profile partnerships placed his private world under public observation, adding pressure to already complex emotional dynamics. Love, in this context, was never entirely private. It was interpreted, discussed, and analyzed externally. Long-term relationships brought moments of stability, but also periods of strain. The difficulty was not unusual in itself, but the scale of attention made ordinary challenges feel amplified. Emotional distance, career demands, and differing personal trajectories contributed to separation and change over time. What becomes clear across these years is not a single narrative of failure or success, but the difficulty of maintaining intimacy under continuous visibility. Relationships require privacy, while fame removes it. That contradiction creates a structural challenge that cannot easily be resolved. At the same time, these relationships were meaningful and formative. They shaped family life, personal growth, and emotional understanding. They also introduced long-term responsibilities that would remain central even after romantic relationships ended. The emotional complexity of this period lies not in dramatic events alone, but in accumulation. Years of adaptation, negotiation, and change under conditions few people experience. It is within that accumulation that the deeper consequences of fame begin to emerge: fatherhood and the passage of time. Becoming a father introduced a new dimension to Brad Pitt's life, one that shifted priorities and altered his understanding of permanence. Children brought structure, meaning, and emotional grounding in ways that professional success could not replicate. For a period, family life appeared to offer stability amid external pressure. However, time and circumstance gradually introduced distance. Careers continued, relationships changed, and family structure evolved. What had once been central became more complicated to maintain in its original form. The demands of co-parenting, geography, and personal transitions created emotional separation that unfolded gradually rather than suddenly. Reflections in later years suggest a recognition of imperfection in how certain moments were handled, not as a single event of regret, but as an awareness of time's irreversibility. Parenthood, once established, cannot be paused or restarted. It moves forward continuously, regardless of personal readiness. The emotional weight of this realization is significant. Success does not protect against absence, and achievement does not replace shared time. These truths become clearer with age, when the consequences of earlier decisions are fully visible. Fatherhood, in his case, remains both a defining experience and a source of reflection. It represents connection, responsibility, and also the complexity of maintaining bonds across changing circumstances. It is within this space that some of the most personal dimensions of his life exist. Legal conflict and public scrutiny. In later years, aspects of Brad Pitt's personal life became entangled in legal proceedings and public discussion. These developments extended over time, drawing attention not only to specific disputes but also to broader questions about family, property, and long-term separation. Such situations, when played out in public view, become more than private matters. They become narratives interpreted by audiences. Legal conflict introduces a different kind of visibility. Unlike fame driven by performance, this visibility is rooted in documentation, interpretation, and external judgment. Every development becomes part of a larger public record, often stripped of emotional context. For individuals involved, this process can be deeply draining. It prolongs emotional separation and keeps unresolved matters active for years. Even when proceedings focus on practical outcomes, the psychological impact often extends beyond formal resolution. At the center of these disputes was not only material concern, but also symbolic weight, shared history, memory, and the remnants of earlier family life. These elements are difficult to quantify, but significant in emotional terms. What emerges from this period is a sense of prolonged transition rather than closure. Legal systems address structure, but not emotional resolution. As a result, certain experiences remain open-ended, continuing to evolve even after formal decisions are made. Later, career, reinvention, and control. In the later stages of his career, Brad Pitt transitioned into roles that reflected greater selectivity and control. Rather than pursuing constant visibility, he began focusing on projects that emphasized creative involvement and production. This shift indicated the change in priorities, from presence to purpose. His work as a producer allowed him to shape narratives rather than simply perform within them. This behind-the-scenes role offered more autonomy and a different kind of influence within the industry. It also reflected a broader trend in his life, moving towards stability rather than expansion. On screen, his performances became more restrained and reflective. There was less emphasis on image and more on nuance. Age, experience, and personal history contributed to a different kind of presence, less about impact, more about depth. Professionally, he remained successful and respected, but the nature of success changed. It became less about dominance and more about sustainability. This transition mirrors a broader life shift toward balance and self-awareness. In many ways, this stage represents adaptation rather than reinvention. The external world still recognizes him as a major figure in cinema, but internally, the focus appears to have shifted toward coherence rather than expansion. Personal reflection and private life. Today, in recent years, Brad Pitt's life has been described in more private and measured terms. Public appearances continue, but with less intensity than earlier decades. There is a noticeable shift toward privacy, routine, and selective engagement with media and industry events. Personal relationships have become more contained, less publicly visible, and more focused on stability than exposure. This reflects a broader change in how he approaches life, prioritizing quiet consistency over public narrative. Aging has also played a role in this transformation. With time comes recalibration of priorities, energy, and emotional focus. The pace of earlier years has given way to a more deliberate rhythm. There is also an evident emphasis on self-awareness, lifestyle choices, work balance, and personal discipline suggest someone navigating the long-term effects of a highly public career. This is not withdrawal, But adjustment, while public perception often freezes individuals in their most visible moments, real life continues to evolve. In this case, evolution appears to lean toward introspection, steadiness, and reduced external noise. The result is a life that remains influential but less performative, defined more by internal structure than external attention. Conclusion: the cost of being seen. Brad Pitt's story is not defined solely by success nor by struggle, but by the coexistence of both across decades of intense visibility. It is a reminder that public achievement and private experience often move at different speeds, and sometimes in different directions entirely. Fame amplified every aspect of his life: career achievements, relationships, and personal challenges. Yet amplification does not equal clarity. If anything, it often distorts proportion, making certain elements larger while leaving others unspoken. What remains consistent throughout his journey is change. Identity was not fixed, but continuously reshaped by circumstance, choice, and time. From early discipline to global recognition, from family formation to separation, from visibility to reflection, his life reflects cycles rather than conclusions. There is no simple resolution to a life lived so publicly. Instead, there is ongoing adjustment, an attempt to reconcile memory with reality and expectation with lived experience. Ultimately, his story resonates because it reflects something universally human: the distance between how life appears and how it feels. Success does not eliminate loss, and visibility does not guarantee understanding. What endures is not perfection, but continuation, the ability to keep moving forward while carrying what cannot be undone. And in that sense, his story is less about celebrity and more about the persistent effort to find equilibrium in a life that was never allowed to remain still.